Bernie Sanders went on Andrew Schultz, which is a political podcast, and made some very interesting remarks about the state of the Democratic Party and really his sort of overarching view of how we got to this moment of having a second Trump administration. But before we look at that, please be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel. It helps out a lot with the algorithm. Now we'll head on over here to X, where we have some clips here that I want to show you guys of Bernie on the Andrew Schultz podcast. This first one where he says that the Democratic Party abandoned workers a long time ago.
Democrats caught on that you could raise a lot of money from 70s, 60s. Democrats caught on that you could raise a lot of money from wealthy people. And it gets back to campaign financing and all that stuff. So you got a Democratic establishment now, which is funded by wealthy people. You have consultants who are really way out of touch with reality, who make a whole lot of money in campaigns. And working class is ignored. Donald Trump comes along and says, I care about you, which was a lie. So
I don't know if that's a lie. I'd give pushback on that. I think that it has to be proven that it's a lie.
All right, I'll prove it.
Yes, thank you. And you're right, I could look through rose-colored glasses, but the idea, I think that when people are struggling, anybody who goes, hey, I'm going to help you out.
Yeah, so Bernie here, he says in the 60s and 70s that the Democratic Party figured out that it could raise money through rich donors, and that's sort of what they have done largely. The super PACs have a large impact on the Democratic primary process. And one of the things I liked about Bernie Sanders back in 2015, when I sort of kind of got into politics, Bernie Sanders, his whole campaign was about individual donations, where his average donation was just $15, but he was still able to outraise Hillary Clinton in the primary. And this ultimately, spurred the DNC to do everything they could to collaborate and keep Bernie out of power by essentially working against him in the primaries, deciding that Bernie Sanders is not somebody that's going to cozy up to us, and he is actually a man of his word and is going to do the things that he talks about because he's not beholden to big corporate donations because of his ability to raise money through small dollar donations. This is one of the things that's most appealing about Bernie Sanders, and I believe is one of the things that's most appealing about publicly financed campaigns in general, is it allows the politician that has a publicly financed campaign to be much more flexible with their policy positions and to actually adopt positions that benefit the working class, because that is who is funding the machine of your campaign, is those very people that you are saying that you are going to help out. So it's like a win-win for everyone. But the way that the Democratic Party is set up, unfortunately, has not been a win-win whatsoever. Let's go down the line here. We're going to keep looking at some of these clips. This one is where he talks about Kamala Harris's election defeat.
He ran on this idea of we're going to make it better for you, instead of Kamala seemed to run on this idea like, hey, it's good, we're going to keep doing the exact same thing, right, which is a losing strategy.
You got it.
So
that was her bloody consult. I mean, I know Kamala. She's a friend. She's very smart. That was what her bloody consultants told her to say. I begged them. I'm just between you.
Why can't she push back? Like at a certain Like,
You're right. Look, there's no argument.
and this is the problem I think a lot of voters had is like they didn't even know if it was her. We didn't even know if Biden was president. We didn't even know if these were her talking points.
So interesting here. Bernie saying that he quote unquote begged them, being Harris's consultants, to not do the whole we're gonna try to attract people to the center right into the Democratic Party thing. Or another way to put it would be we're gonna try to attract people who are not Democrats, not liberals, but are not fully on the Trump MAGA train, and are just looking for someone to go back to an old era of America and get us back to having bipartisanship and all that. I believe that ultimately that was one of Biden's missteps that he made in the early part of his administration. Now, somewhere along the line, Biden did wake up and smell the coffee and went, yeah, there's no such thing as bipartisanship anymore. There's no really working with this fascistic party that does not represent working people whatsoever. And he kind of dropped that whole charade somewhere maybe in mid 2022, early 2023 or so. They started to get a little more aggressive with the messaging. But by then it was where a lot of people were feeling the effects of inflation, and you had Trump saying it's all Biden's fault, and if you get me back in office, I'll lower inflation for you. And a lot of people went along with that because the Democratic Party didn't really make the point well enough that the Republicans don't have any plan for American people out there, and their plans aren't going to lower inflation whatsoever. And in fact, the inflation is actually due to Donald Trump's mishandling of the economy in many cases. But yeah, I think that, it's interesting to hear Bernie say that he begged Harris's consultants to take a different approach than they did. Maybe we need to start listening to Bernie a little more, given that the DNC, I don't want to say just the DNC, that's not quite fair. But the party, the leftists in this country have lost twice to a candidate, not a very particularly strong candidate in Trump, right? I think that he was beatable in 2016. He was beatable this last time around. But maybe we need to start picking up a little bit more on what the direction that Bernie's saying the party should go. Maybe it'll do us well. Now we're going to look at him talking about the primary process, where he says that the Democratic Party is, in fact, in a way, a threat to democracy as well. Let's check it out here.
4 elections, Democrats, we felt that we didn't have a say on who could be president. We talk a lot about the Republicans being autocrats and oligarchs and taking over democracy, but from the Democrat perspective, and I'm a lifelong Democrat, I felt like the Democratic Party completely removed the democratic process from its constituents. And I think they need to have some accountability of that.
No argument here.
I donated for you. I mean, I wanted you to 2016. I was like, this is going to happen. This guy's going to do it. And it felt like they stole it from me. And I'll be honest, it broke my heart when you supported him.
Look, but you have, in the world that I live in, you got a choice. And I mean, a lot of people, including my wife, agree with you. But, you're down to a choice. Is it going to be Hillary Clinton or is it going to be Donald Trump? Not a great choice.
But it ended up being him anyway, so why don't we burn it down?
Well, because it's easy to say burning it down means that children are not going to have food to eat, that the schools will deteriorate, people will not have health care.
I got it.
And I'm an elected official. I got to represent the people.
That's fair.
And I can't turn my back on.
But then could we not also say, if ostensibly there hasn't been a fair primary for the Democrats since 2008, are they not also a threat to democracy? Yes. We often hear.
Fair enough. That is. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that point.
Wow. Bernie Sanders saying he's not going to argue with the point that the Democratic Party is a threat to democracy itself. I mean, wow, that is shocking to hear. But let's look at what happened quickly here in the last, two primaries, right? In 2020, you had a Sanders who was definitely benefiting from a split up field of candidates that none of them were particularly resonating very well with the American people, and none of them seemed to be a clear-cut choice to take the helm of the party. Let's remember Joe Biden got, I think it was 6th or 7th place in the Iowa caucuses in 2020. To state that Pete Buttigieg ultimately ended up carrying over Bernie Sanders by, I think it was about 1/10 of a percentage point that Buttigieg won by. The Iowa caucuses do work a bit differently than the traditional primary process, but what did we see, right? We saw Buttigieg won Iowa. Biden finished 6th or 7th place. I can't remember off the top of my head. And we saw Bernie pick up states like Nevada. He won California, and it was very clear that Bernie Sanders was a threat to the Democratic establishment once again in 2020. And right before Super Tuesday, all of the more centrist candidates all got together on a Zoom call or whatever and said, we need to throw our weight behind Joe Biden to beat Trump, because ultimately there was this fear or something that none of them were going to be able to do it, but we can't have Sanders give him even a chance to benefit from us, the centrists, being divided, splitting the vote. So what did they do? They all dropped out all at the same time. I remember the day. I remember the exact moment that I read looking down at my phone on the bus, reading everybody is all dropping out and all endorsing Biden right before the South Carolina primary. And Biden won South Carolina, and the rest is history, right? Biden thankfully did win this election, and did have a successful presidency, I will say. Biden did have a much more successful presidency than I anticipated he was going to have. And Biden was able to get the job done in many cases. But what happened, lo and behold, right? The Democrats failed to articulate a message that Donald Trump is, in fact, not for working people, and that his message is not going to benefit anyone but himself and the Mar-a-Lago elites. And we lost a very winnable election. Try to do some switcheroo there at the end with getting a different candidate in for the last 100 days. But it was clear that at that point, Biden was already a very unpopular president, which is unfortunate because of the amount of legislative successes that Joe Biden did ultimately have, but it wasn't messaged well enough to the American people, and the American people didn't feel it for whatever reason. But what they did feel is the effects of inflation that we didn't point out was Trump's fault well enough. And that's what happened in 2020. Let's go back to 2016, where the colluding was much more insidious and, potentially getting into violations of campaign finance laws and campaign laws in general. And I think that in 2016 Bernie Sanders would have beat Donald Trump, and I think that a lot of Democratic elitists out there that have, as Bernie pointed out, abandoned the working class people in this country somewhere in the 60s and 70s, they saw between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump that one of those two would be substantially better for maintaining the status quo than Bernie Sanders getting in there. And this led to some dirty politics that the Democratic Party participated in against Sanders, and really pushed, I think, a lot of people away from the Democratic Party, that ultimately they were able to win back some of them in 2020 after people watched the disaster of how Trump handled COVID and told people to do stuff like inject bleach into their veins, and that sunlight is going to somehow disinfect, sunlight is going to cure COVID. All sorts of crazy stuff was going down in relation to the virus, and that's basically why Trump lost, right? It wasn't because anything that the Democrats were doing. It was because Trump was he let the pandemic get so out of hand that a lot of normie voters out there turned against him. And, Trump was able to win a lot of those voters back, it seems, or at least enough of them, maintain enough support, while the Democratic Party, the support for the Biden-Harris campaign, the bottom fell out of it. Why? Why is that? Could it be because that the Democratic Party still hasn't learned the lessons that it should have learned a long time ago from the 2016 election? That messing with the primary process and colluding to hurt Sanders' campaign directly, where the American people were saying, this is who we want. This is a candidate who is very, he energizes working class people, people of color, young people, just across the board, right? Bernie Sanders energizes American voters. And ultimately it was where, it's hard to say, oh, if X, then Y, right? It's hard to say that. It's hard to say if the DNC and Debbie Wasserman Schultz had not done what they did to Sanders, that Sanders would have been elected. I'm not exactly 100% sure about that, but what they didn't need to do was do everything they can to hurt Sanders, right? That didn't help him. They certainly, right? It's like they didn't. They did the opposite of helping him. They did the opposite of attempting to run a fair primary, a fair and square primary, right? They didn't want a fair and square primary. They wanted Sanders to go away, and they wanted, and they felt their feet to the fire that Sanders brought to them with his electrifying message of, we're going to do things that uplift working class people in this country. They ultimately said, that's something we don't want any part of, and we're going to do everything we can to put our thumb on the scale to help out Hillary's campaign. That's what they did. They lost to Donald Trump. And I'm not going to lie. I felt vindicated. I felt vindicated the day of the election or so. It was like, yeah, the Democratic Party deserved to lose that race. And after a while, that feeling faded very quickly after Trump started doing crazy shit like banning Muslims from being able to come into the country from particular countries. Totally racist, policy on day one that Trump implemented, and it was like, okay, that vindication went away very, very quickly. But it was a shame to see what they did in 2016. Much less so in 2020. That was going to be a harder election, I think, for Sanders to win. But what the Democratic Party definitely needs to not be doing is looking at the working class candidates that are electrifying working class people across the country and then going, we're going to do everything in our power to hurt that candidate. That's the opposite of what needs to be happening right now. And to highlight that point, I want to show you here that it's now AOC who's seen as the face of the Democratic Party, and it's not even close. AOC is seen as the face of the Democratic Party, according to new polling. From May 7 to May 9th, 1,462 likely voters were polled. 26% identified Ocasio-Cortez as the face of the party. Another 26% said that no one is leading the party. Well, I mean, that would be correct too. So 50% of the country either thinks that we have no leaders or that AOC is the leader. That is a damning indictment of the political direction that the Democratic Party has wanted to go for a good while now. It's a damning indictment that it is not going to win you power in this country any longer, and that the way to win power in this country is to, in fact, speak to working class issues and working class people that make up the vast, vast majority of the population of this country, and not be so scared and so skittish to scare off centrist voters. They're not pushing us over the edge. The centrist voters, the disenfranchised with MAGA people, but not Democrats that are out there, they are not putting you into power, the Democratic Party. They're not doing it. Stop catering and favoring their votes. Start doing what Bernie Sanders has done since the 1960s and fight for working class issues. Fight for working class people, and we will elect you. That is what Bernie Sanders' electrifying, stunning campaigns that he ran should have told the Democratic establishment. It doesn't seem like they've got the message, unfortunately. And we got guys like Chuck Schumer up there, who I'm not sure if Chuck Schumer has any energy or enthusiasm left in him. I mean, I don't know if he has the fight. I don't know if some of these Democrats in this country, in our leadership, I don't know if they have the fight in them to stand up to Donald Trump. And it's just ridiculous when you have Trump, who is by all means a madman, by all means somebody who is not very smart, not very calculating, not very cunning, right? He says the things that people want to hear, that his base wants to hear, and it's put him into power twice now. And really, it's an indictment of a lack of vision, a lack of the Democratic Party having anything to offer to the vast majority of working people for a long, long time now. And that absolutely needs to change if we are to have a blue wave in this country.